Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Dan for the weather. What an exciting evening. Thanks also to the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters for providing the opportunity to speak with all of you here tonight, and congratulations to the honorees. I also want to do a shout out and thank my sister-in-law and niece who are here tonight. They're so special to me, and it's special to have you here, so thank you. In my few minutes with you, I'm hoping to provide a reminder of the compelling need to continue on our journey to advance environmental justice, a journey that is even more essential because of the relationship between racial inequality and environmental justice. Then I'd like to touch on some of the unprecedented steps forward that we're taking at EPA. I know the next speaker can probably disagree with my points and tell you the truth, but really, I am so proud of what we're doing. We have a long way to go, but I'm excited to share what we're doing. I don't need to tell this group that the United States developed as a deeply segregated society through policies of racial segregation and redlining. The key message here, though, is that the vestiges of these policies on land use have never been uprooted. I had the incredible honor of working with North Carolina civil rights hero Julius Chambers early in my career. As some of the people in this room, at least of my generation and older, may know, Julius Chambers argued Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg County, a case about whether boards of education had a duty to take overt steps to achieve racial diversity to overcome school segregation. Though the full promise of equal education remains illusory, in 1971, the Supreme Court ruled, they said this, that school authorities had the obligation to eliminate from the public schools all vestiges of state-imposed segregation. Quoting an earlier case, the court made clear that school authorities were charged with a duty to take whatever steps might be necessary to eliminate racial discrimination, root and branch. Unlike the field of public education, though, segregatory patterns of land use have never been uprooted. If, for example, areas where communities of color resided, I keep thinking this is going to fall. If, for example, areas where communities of color resided were deemed industrial and polluting facilities were clustered nearby, there was no moment, no Supreme Court case that demanded that zoning lines be redrawn or polluting facilities closed or moved to address racial inequality. As a result, today, race, color, and national origin, a person's racial and ethnic background, is a predictor of exposure to pollutants such as particulate matter, or PM 2.5, that affects the respiratory system, and to incidence of illness. Urban and rural areas often remain starkly divided by income and race, which impacts the opportunities available to community members and the health of residents, particularly residents of Black and Latino communities, indigenous communities, and low-income populations. Today, residential segregation persists. I know, I'm the downer part of the evening. And the zip code in which a person lives is a predictor of their access to clean air, all those things we talked about before, clean air, clean water, and a safe place for their children to play. We can look online to find the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, and I encourage you, if you haven't done this, to find the HOLC maps that were used for decades, starting in the 1930s. These maps were made for hundreds of American cities with populations of 40,000 or more. For example, in Durham, North Carolina, where I'm staying tonight and have family. The maps designated areas that Black residents lived, either in or near, as the riskiest for real estate investment. On a scale of A to D, these communities were designated as a D and deemed, and I use this word, hazardous. The term redlining is used to describe the denial of loans to such areas by banks and insurers, and is associated with HOLC's use of the color red on the map that was designated as a D. These practices left a racialized footprint on the way in which we use land. Indeed, a recent body of literature has reported on the relationship between redlining in our history and current neighborhood environments, including, for example, current exposure to PM 2.5, particulate matter, and health outcomes. A 2022 meta-study, a study that looked at all the studies that have come out about redlining and current conditions, 17 such articles reported, and this is a quote, overall, studies nearly universally report evidence of an association between redlining, that is our past, and health-related outcomes in our current time. I'm sure I don't need to spend more time with this group on the continued imprint of the policies of racial segregation and redlining on life conditions and life chances for today, and the need for us to eliminate the vestiges of discrimination, root and branch. Before turning to the optimistic side of this, what we're doing to protect the rights of all people to a healthy and safe environment, what we're doing to address this long-standing relationship between exposure to pollution and race, color, national origin, income, and zip code, I want to acknowledge that our work stands on the shoulders of those who came before us, both inside and outside of the federal government. Those laying down their lives and going to jail in Warren County led this movement. And in their seminal report, Toxic Waste and Race, the United Church of Christ called on the federal government to develop an environmental justice advisory group, open an office of environmental justice, and issue an executive order to advance environmental justice, all recommendations that had an impact and were adopted. We stand on the shoulders of those who were and are marching in the streets and calling for action around the nation, and particularly here in North Carolina. These calls for action continue to be an important driver of change. So what are we doing? Well, I only have time to highlight a few of the steps we're taking to advance environmental justice, equity, and civil rights in this truly extraordinary moment. But here we go. First, from his first days in office, President Biden issued a suite of executive orders directing the federal government to pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity for all. There are two, not one, two equity executive orders and an environmental justice executive order and a climate executive order that includes environmental justice. At EPA, and I should say that both the first and the second equity executive orders require that all agencies develop an equity plan. At EPA, we committed in both our equity plan and our strategic plan to key approaches which we are implementing. And since they're in our strategic plan, we hold ourselves accountable for progress. So these include considering and addressing cumulative impacts in our decision-making, supporting and incorporating community-based participatory science in our decision-making, and we're not only funding community science, but setting up a community-engaged research collaborative for learning and excellence, or CERCLA. We love acronyms. In Edison, New Jersey, to align EPA's science with the needs of local communities, and working together for action. Strengthening our civil rights enforcement. I have to pause on civil rights enforcement for just a moment. You may not know that I have many ties to the state of North Carolina, and it's just great to be here. My husband grew up in North Carolina, and as I said, his family still lives here in Raleigh and in Durham. Before joining the Biden administration, I also had the honor of representing and working with three organizations, Waterkeeper, North Carolina EJ Network, and REACH. And we am representing them in a civil rights case filed against the North Carolina DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality. Then Secretary of DEQ, Michael Regan, was on the opposite side of the table in that case. At the time, I never would have guessed that he would someday be my boss at EPA. Back to the approaches in our agency equity plan, which also include building community capacity and access through technical assistance and grants, and strengthening our own capacity. We have a long way to go for community engagement through, for example, expanding language access and access for people with disabilities. President Biden also committed the federal government to Justice 40. For the first time in the nation's history, the federal government has committed at least 40% of the benefits of a broad range of federal investments, billions of dollars in climate change, clean energy, energy efficiency, clean transit, housing, workforce development, clean water, wastewater infrastructure, among many others, to communities that have been marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. EPA expects to far exceed the 40% commitment. In April, and I should say I'm proud to work for the guy who was across the table. In April, President Biden also signed Executive Order, and this is a number you should remember, it's going to go down in history, 14096, revitalizing our nation's commitment to environmental justice, which builds on the historic Environmental Justice Executive Order signed in the 1990s by President Clinton. And this executive order strengthens our commitments. The new order recognizes the legacy of racial discrimination and segregation explicitly, talks about redlining, exclusionary zoning, and other discriminatory land use decisions, and the relationship to the location of polluting facilities today, and directs all agencies to address the remnants of discrimination that persists today. Among other things, the new executive order creates greater accountability, adopts an all-of-government approach by broadening the reach of the executive order to all agencies in the federal government, not just a list that was in the old executive order. Recognizing civil rights enforcement as a key strategy for advancing environmental justice, it makes clear that advancing environmental justice means fully, and it has that word, fully protecting people from the disproportionate impacts of our programs and activities, taking into account climate change, cumulative impacts, and the legacy of racism or other structural or systemic barriers. We are rolling up our sleeves and getting to work to implement this new executive order. At EPA last September, Administrator Regan, and I got to go with him, traveled to Warren County to announce the creation of the new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. And you're right, it is a mouthful. My title, I have to read it too, don't worry about it. But the new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, acronym, and I've practiced this, don't try it at home without me, OEJECR. Created the program, OEJECR, and put it on par with our Office of Air and Radiation, our Office of Water. Our new office brings environmental justice from the margins to the center of the agency. And we're charged not only with housing particular grant programs and activities like external civil rights, conflict prevention and resolution, but integrating, and of course I don't want to forget our $3 billion environmental justice and climate justice grant program, but also, equally as important, integrating environmental justice and external civil rights in all EPA programs and activities. As the administrator says, environmental justice is part of the DNA of the agency. You just can't accomplish our mission to protect human health and the environment for all people without taking into account the particular needs of underserved communities, those who need it most. The Inflation Reduction Act, as you've heard, targets billions of dollars to disadvantaged communities. OEJECR, you all know what that is now, we are charged with administering $3 billion in environmental justice and climate justice block grants. This is unprecedented and transformational. In 2 years, we went from a budget for environmental justice grants in the order of $1 to $2 million to $100 million under bill to now $3 billion. We have multiple grant programs in the pipeline, and look out because there's more to come this summer, not only in OEJECR, but across the federal government, all targeting a transformative level of investment to communities that were for too long overlooked. We're particularly excited, and I can't leave without mentioning that we're setting up 17 thriving communities, technical assistance centers, or TICTACs. Now, I know you're not going to disagree with me on this one. The TICTACs, this is a good acronym. You can all remember this one, TICTACs. TICTACs will be providing technical assistance to community groups and local governments from disadvantaged communities all across the country. Here in EPA Region 4, the Deep South Center and its partners, including North Carolina Central University, form the core of the regional TICTAC. The Tic Tacs will provide training and other assistance to build capacity for navigating what we know to be a maze of federal grants and programs, help managing grant funding, provide guidance on community engagement, translation and interpretation, meeting facilitation, and other areas for technical assistance. We're moving forward on so many fronts. EPA is prioritizing environmental justice enforcement. And please look online. We have 4 memos describing how we're prioritizing environmental justice in enforcement. We're clarifying our legal authorities to advance environmental justice. Again, look online. I hope you all have read this. It's only 200 pages, good nighttime reading. If you haven't read it yourself, at least bring it to your local and state governments, or those of you who are from local or state governments. There's a document called Legal Tools for Advancing Environmental Justice. Those of you who think we don't have authority to advance environmental justice goes through each of our organic environmental statutes. Take a look, and then we added an appendix, an addendum on our authority to advance cumulative impacts. Right? We are looking at what those authorities are. Engaging communities. The administrator has led the way on public engagement with his Journey to Justice tours in Louisiana and Texas, the Virgin Islands and West Virginia. And his Journey to Justice had led not only to listening and hearing, but to concrete action. Our Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance is using its authority to conduct unannounced inspections at suspected non-compliant facilities, and EPA launched something called the Pollution Accountability Team, which combines monitoring with inspections. Just today, Administrator Regan was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, announcing historic resources to clean up pollution at legacy sites. I'll end with a few words. I could go on forever. I am so excited by what we're doing, but don't worry, I won't. I'll end with a few words on our efforts to strengthen civil rights enforcement. I know so many of you here in North Carolina have been pushing for civil rights enforcement, and it is so critical. And of course, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has its roots in North Carolina. If you don't know about that, we could talk afterward. EPA, like other federal agencies, has the responsibility. Okay, I'll talk about, no, just kidding. EPA, like other federal agencies, has the responsibility for ensuring that recipients of our funding comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, among other civil rights laws. Title VI prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin by recipients of federal funds. And the origin, by the way, just this like your little extra tidbit, comes from Sims versus Moses Cone Memorial Hospital, which was a case, for those of you who knows Moses Cone Memorial Hospital here in North Carolina, where there was formal segregation, and it went through the courts in 1963, and that gave rise to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So as you may know, EPA's poor record of civil rights enforcement over decades was notorious, but we are turning the ship around. We're moving from reactive to proactive, finally using, for the first time, our affirmative authority to initiate compliance reviews rather than waiting for complaints to come in the door. We're strengthening what's called pre-award reviews to make sure that all recipients of federal funds have a baseline of compliance with civil rights laws. We're improving transparency. We've put our docket online. We're innovating with new ways to bring parties together, to overcome the distrust that builds up over years, and to bring communities into discussions and settlement processes, and so much more. This is a historic moment. Our grant programs are targeting an unprecedented level of investment in underserved communities, and the federal government is committed to ensuring that investments are made where they're needed most. We are implementing commitments to environmental justice, integrating environmental justice and external civil rights in all of our programs and activities, and finally enforcing civil rights. Ultimately, we will be judged, and we will judge the success of our efforts by the change we see in communities. Together right now, I truly believe we have the opportunity together to make a difference. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you tonight.